If you're like me, staying home alone every day in the summer can become a bit of a drag. I've always been someone who needs to stay busy all the time as well. I don't like being alone and like to always be active. Last year, after finishing my freshman year of college, I decided to take a summer job to make some extra cash. I worked for a landscaping company, but the pay was all under the table. I won't put the name of the company out there, but the owner seemed quite eager to get me the hell on immediately. I figured perhaps I could become a full-time employee later in the summer. For the time being, he agreed to pay me based on the different jobs we did. For the first few weeks, it was pretty great. I was getting a nice tan, and I was getting jacked from all the lifting as well. The first 3 weeks he paid me, and I was getting paid quite well. By the time we got to the 4th week, though, is when things started to get a little bit weird. He would usually pay me on Friday, but he didn't pay me this week. When I brought it up to him, he just smiled and said he was going to start paying me every 2 weeks instead. I was kind of annoyed, but basically said whatever, because I figured I'd just have a fatter paycheck every other week. Well, fast forward another week and I still don't get paid. Now I'm pretty upset. I'd been doing some hard work for 2 weeks and was not getting paid. I called my boss immediately and asked what the damn deal was. He claimed he just forgot and was really sorry. I shrugged it off, whatever, it's fine, as long as you pay me in the end. We agreed to meet on Saturday for the payment. I went to the spot he told me to meet him at, and he handed me an envelope. I took it and told him I'd see him on Monday. Well, when I opened that envelope, it was just pay for a single week. I called him absolutely furious, but he insisted he'd already paid me for the previous week. I flipped out over it and told him I didn't want to continue working, especially under the table, as it was making me uncomfortable with the payments. He called and begged me to come back for a huge job we had next week and said he would even pay me double as well. I agreed, thinking this would likely be my last job with him and I could take the cash and move on. Monday comes and I meet him at this huge house, surrounded by nothing but open land. We started laying down mulch and setting up the front yard. Before I knew it, I was all alone. I didn't see him anywhere. I started to get angry again. I was now by myself doing all of this work. After an hour or so, I finally saw him emerge from the back of the house. He looked frustrated and almost a little bit nervous. He came up to me, and in a very soft voice he said, "Can you go see if you can get the water turned on in the basement? I was trying all day, but I just couldn't get it to work. Please." It was such a weird request, but honestly, I wanted to get out of the heat for a second, so I accepted. Once in the basement, I found the water hookup in a matter of moments, but what I noticed immediately was that the water was already on. I turned around quickly, and that's when I saw my boss and a skinny woman I'd never seen before standing behind me. He had his hands out facing me, and she had one hand behind her back, clearly concealing something. Before I could even ask what was going on, he said this: "You shouldn't have come down here, and just so you know, I am sorry." Thinking quickly on my feet though, I kicked him in his ankle and plowed through the skinny woman. I ran all the way to my car and drove away and called the police immediately. The worst part about all this though was that there was nothing they could do because I was technically working under the table. There were no records of this man's company, even though I had seen trucks with the logo on it. Fortunately for me at least, the guy didn't know where I lived because it was all under the table. It almost seemed like the company was a scam from the very start. I'm not sure what his intentions with me ever were. I know there's a lot I could have done differently, but that was easily the weirdest experience of my life. Was that psycho really going to try and kill me over just a week or so of pay? Either way, I'm glad I never ran into that landscaping psychopath ever again. Two years ago, my wife and I purchased a small property on the lake for the family to spend the summer months away from the hustle and bustle of the city. As soon as kindergarten concluded for the year, my wife and I packed up our belongings and our 5-year-old son to set off for this new summer vacation home. My wife is a biologist, and she would be able to work from home due to our location and the research she could do from on the property. Our family was quite fortunate that she had such a successful job that also allowed us the freedom to live comfortably. Unfortunately for me, we've moved a lot over the last 10 to 15 years, and I've not been able to stay with the same company for an extended period of time. This new town had one small grocery store that seemed to be the main location everyone used for shopping. It also seemed to be a hotspot for tourists who would visit once the weather turned warm. I'd had some butchery training from jobs I'd had in my early 20s, so finding work was usually not very difficult. I applied for a job at this small store and got the job almost immediately. There would be 2 butchers on staff, myself and the guy who ran the store, Will, the same person who'd hired me. For the first few weeks, he seemed like a pretty quiet and laid-back guy. I would get to work every day shortly after 7 a.m. He never really cared that I was 5 minutes late. He was about 6 foot tall, greasy black hair, and a very prominent nose as well. He had these really small green beady eyes too. His voice was low and rumbled a bit when he talked. After the first few weeks, I started to notice things getting a little bit odd. His temper would sometimes get out of hand and he would explode on me seemingly out of completely nowhere. Then 5 minutes later, he'd be totally cool, like it never even happened. It didn't bother me too much because he was technically my boss. I assumed maybe he had some kind of anger issues, and I'm not one to judge anyway. After these few weeks of little outbursts, though, they began to get more and more uncomfortable. He would start saying things like, "You better get this done when I leave, or you'll be sorry." Or sometimes he'd mumble things under his breath and I'd catch them, like, "Sometimes I think you'd be more help to me if you were dead." This stuff made me uncomfortable, but again, I assume maybe that's just how he managed. I'd met a lot of old-school butchers during my time in this business, and some of them were very intense individuals. I figured this was just one more of the same. Fast forward, though, to a day when I showed up to work 15 minutes late. I'd gotten caught in a surprise traffic jam, and unfortunately, there are no alternate routes to get to the store. I showed up, and Will was just standing in the meat cooler, staring at me. He had this black apron on, covered in blood from cutting all morning, and the butcher knife still in his hand. I tried to apologize, but before I could even speak, he put his hand up to silence me. "This will be the last time you're late. The last time you disrespect me." He kind of paused for a moment and looked down at the ground, then finished by giving me a smile and saying, "Never mind, just don't be late again, okay?" The next few days, he was very quiet, like something was bothering him a lot. To me, it was great not having to hear him complain about everything, though. He left early one day and told me to make sure I cut a few extra things and to maybe clean the meat room as well. It was about 7 p.m. I was about to call it a night and head home when I noticed something. In the back corner of the meat cooler, we had what were called bone cans. It was basically a waste can where you dispose of all the bones and extra trimmed fat. Coming out of the bottom of one of these cans was a large pool of blood. Now, ordinarily, this wouldn't be a huge deal. You see this sometimes with a job, but this pool looked very fresh, and the smell was extremely bad. When I tried to move the can, it was much heavier than it usually was. They get picked up once a week, but this week they were a day late for some reason. I took the lid off and almost passed out because of the smell. I noticed the meat in there was a strange color, and there was so much more blood than usual. I put the lid back and left that night trying to figure out what the hell that was and why it smelled so damn bad. I've been in the business for a long time, and I've smelled bad meat before, but this was on another level. The next day when I came in, Will was standing in the cooler, looking very angry. He came at me with a crazed look in his eye and a knife in his hand. "What do you think you saw in the can?" He started to poke my chest and said in a really hostile voice, "Come on, pal, tell me what you saw. I know you were digging. Just tell me what you think you saw." His voice started to turn into a yell, and this is where I decided to call it quits. Put your hands on me, it's done. Crazy thing is, I don't even know how he knew I looked in there. I left, and he actually followed me out to my car, not to apologize, but to keep harassing me about the bone can. I drove off and looked in my mirror, only to see he was still standing in the parking lot, yelling to himself. I drove home immediately, and my wife, of course, supported me. She was happy to let me spend the rest of summer break with my son, being a stay-at-home dad instead of dealing with crazy people. About a week after the incident where I'd quit, though, I was awoken in my recliner, in my living room close to 4 a.m. I was awoken by lights outside of a car driving by the property. My wife was already gone for the day, and my son was still sleeping. All the lights in the house were off. I made my way cautiously to the window, where I saw a massive red pickup truck parked outside the house. Scary part is, there was no one inside the truck, and even though I couldn't make out a lot of details in the dark, the truck looked exactly like the one always parked outside the grocery store, the one that belonged to Will. I went to my son's room and stayed there awake for the rest of the night. About 7:30 a.m., I looked outside, and the truck was now gone. For the next several nights, I saw that truck driving around the block, but I could never make out the driver. I told my wife what I'd been seeing, and she recommended we go back to the house in the city, as her current project was almost done anyway. A few weeks after being back there, I headed out back to the lake to grab some of the items we'd forgotten. When I got there, the windows were broken, and things had been tossed around like someone had been inside the property. I did report this to local authorities, mostly to document the damage that had been done. I don't have any proof technically that Will caused the damage, or that my family was technically in danger, but I know something is off about that guy, and I think next year we're planning on selling that property and finding one much further away from that area. I'm currently in my late 20s, but at the time of these events, my 8th grade school year had just ended. I was excited that I was going to be able to spend the entire summer with my 2 closest buddies, and we would be heading into 9th grade together. We didn't really do much other than just hang out, play PS2, play some basketball outside, and of course message some girls from our class on Instant Messenger, which I hope most of you remember what that was. If not, I guess I'm getting way too old. We would usually hang out at my house because my parents were always pretty cool with my friends being there. The way my house was set up, we pretty much had a ton of privacy, which was awesome for teenage boys being idiots together. My house at the time was located on a pretty quiet street, but my neighborhood was in very close proximity to the more rough sections of my hometown. A close walk from my house was a corner store that sold really cheap soda, chips, and candy. This was obviously a frequent destination for my friends and I. Well, about a week after 8th grade had ended, my 2 buddies were staying the night like they always did. We thought it would be a cool idea to sneak out of the house after my parents went to sleep and walk to the corner store a few blocks away. Of course, not to do anything crazy, but just to have the thrill of being out late on our own. Being a foolish teenager, I had no awareness of the danger I was potentially putting myself and my friends in. Around 11 p.m., my parents went to sleep, and that's when we decided to sneak out of the home. At first, the thrill of being out was awesome, but that feeling would soon change when we arrived at the store. We went in with about $20 and planned on spending it on a whole bunch of random snacks. We all split up to grab our own things. I was in the back corner looking at the soda when I noticed someone lurking in the opposite corner. The only reason why this was concerning to me was because he was facing me and not looking at the shelves of products. I pretended I didn't notice him. Who knows, maybe it was just a coincidence. I looked at the sodas when I noticed in the reflection of the cooler that the shadowy figure was now moving closer, still obviously observing me. I quickly grabbed a 2-liter bottle and went to find my friends. I darted away. When I looked back, the figure was standing right where I'd been just a moment ago, still facing me. I was freaked out. I didn't want to let my friends know that I was, though. I also want to add there was nobody else in the store other than us, the cashier, and this guy or girl, whoever they were. We grabbed our stuff and cashed out quickly. I was trying to be very fast about it, but my friends were being stupid and loud, perhaps trying to show off. Honestly, it was freaking me out. We started the several block walk home. I was moving pretty good. Finally, my friend stopped and asked me what my problem was. I told them what had happened in the store, and they seemed pretty rattled as well. We continued moving quickly from then on. My house was only 100 feet away at this point when I noticed the person from the store was now running full speed up the hill right at us. We ran as fast as we could. Luckily for us, the lunatic was still quite a ways away yet. We ran into the front door and for some reason still tried to be quiet as to not wake my parents. We turned around and locked the door and made sure all the lights were off. The person reached the door and started to bang angrily. That's when I finally gave in to logic and woke my parents, who immediately called the police. I tried yelling through the door that we called the cops, but the person didn't seem to respond or care. He kept trying to force open the door and continued to bang on it. After a minute or two, he took a decorative stone from our front yard and broke the window next to the front door. That's when I finally got a good look at the guy. He tried to climb in through the broken glass, and the glass knocked his hood off. He was completely expressionless, dirty blonde hair, clean shaven. Honestly, he looked like a completely normal guy. He was about halfway through the window when my dad came out with a bat and started swinging at his face. Before there was too much of a struggle though, we saw the lights and heard the sirens. The cops emerged from their car, screaming, and pulled the man out the window. It was the most intense thing I've ever seen with my own eyes. The man was obviously arrested. Apparently, he had no criminal history and no history of drugs or alcohol. When questioned by the police, he had this to say. "You know, honestly, I was a bit bored. I just felt like being a little bit evil tonight." We have no idea what his intentions were, but we felt incredibly lucky we came out of that event physically unharmed. Mentally, I still think about that night over a decade later. I used to stay up for hours, thinking that if we hadn't been that far ahead of him, he would have caught up to us, and who knows what he would have done. I also would stay up for hours in fear that he would show up to my house again when I least expected it. It just goes to show that even the most harmless decision can sometimes lead to consequences you regret for years. The events of this story happened a couple of years ago to my friends and I after our last day of high school on our senior year. We decided to celebrate the event by hiking and camping in the massive forest close to our hometown. We'd talked about this for years actually, and this was going to be our celebration for graduating. Our friend group was pretty outdoorsy, but so were most of the people who grew up there. Anyway, we had always heard there was a beautiful crystal clear lake right in the middle of the forest. It was supposedly accompanied by breathtaking waterfalls as well. One of our friends, Chris, got hiking directions to the lake, and we decided to make this post-graduation trip a reality. Chris had the most outdoor experience of all of us, so we trusted him completely to make the plans. It was Chris, his girlfriend Mindy, myself, my friend Danny, and our other friend Tony with his girlfriend Marissa. The trip was planned as a 3-day hiking trip while camping each night under the stars. It sounded amazing. We would reach the lake on the second day, then start heading back. We would have to camp one more night, then be back on the third day pretty early in the morning. The trip started out amazing. I've never been the biggest fan of sleeping in a tent personally, but the views were truly breathtaking. The sounds, the way the sun shined down through the trees, it made it seem like we were exploring another world almost. Once it started to get dark, we decided to set up camp for the night. It was pretty comical, watching us trying to set up tents while exhausted, but we managed to figure it out eventually. We stayed up for a little while telling stories and playing pitch as well. We called it a night relatively early though, so we could start back up hiking at sunrise and enjoy the view that much more. Danny and I were woken up though in our tent shortly after 3 a.m. We swore we could hear some noises right outside. It sounded like air or something, but it didn't have the same quality of the howling of the wind. He told me of course it must be the wind. There was nothing to worry about. But to me, it sounded more like a ton of whispers. You could hear sticks cracking in the distance. You'd expect to hear quiet or even crickets or something, but instead there was all sorts of random racket. I had a horrible feeling that maybe there was a bear or something outside, maybe even another person. Then fear came over me, suddenly feeling we were not alone. Danny went back to sleep, but I was fully wired for the rest of the night. I sat clenching my pillow and jumped at every noise. A little after 6, I heard Chris outside his tent, and I went out to greet him. He'd also heard these weird noises, and admitted that in all his long years of camping, he'd never heard anything like that. Still, he wasn't particularly alarmed either, though. We packed up our gear and continued to the lake. If we kept up a good pace, we'd make it by noon. We all seemed sluggish and tired from the night, though. We were more tired and short with each other today than the previous day. I had an uneasy feeling the entire day, the feeling that someone was out there, following us. At 12:30, we arrived at the lake finally, and honestly, it was completely worth it. The waterfalls looked like beautiful glass with the way they reflected the sun, and the water looked like it was glowing. It was breathtaking. We swam for a while and played by the waterfall as well. The events of the previous evening seemed to vanish from my mind for a while. We got dry and decided to start heading back early so our third day of hiking tomorrow would not be so bad. We set up camp about 5 hours or so from our cars. If it was up to me, I would have just kept walking, but anybody who's been in the woods at nightfall knows it's pitch black. Maybe not so worth getting lost. We decided to set up camp and get home tomorrow instead. We were all pretty beat and passed out almost right away after setting it up. Again though, I was jolted awake after 3 a.m. This time there was no mistaking it. There were clearly voices outside our tent. I could hear women's voices, several of them. They were laughing. Not laughing like in a playful giggle, but a deep screeching laugh. We could hear branches on the ground breaking around us. It seemed like we were completely surrounded. Danny was awake with me, and he was scared stiff. We could only make out a few words amongst all the mumbling. We could hear these creepy voices saying things in a low, drawn-out way. Things like, flesh, and strike. I want to strike. These horrifying phrases were followed by cackling and mumbles we couldn't make out. We sat in fear all night, listening to these noises. It would stop for a time, then start back up sounding like it was directly outside. At sunrise, we heard Chris yell outside his tent. We rushed out, only to find a staggering amount of footprints surrounding our campsite completely. They went in all sorts of directions, with seemingly no rhyme or reason. There was a strange pattern of rocks and sticks set up all over the campsite as well. The sticks looked bent to resemble human effigies. We packed our gear in record time and ran the rest of the way out the forest. Unlike the previous 2 days, we could hear laughing and twigs snapping in the distance the entire trek back to the cars. Myself and Mindy started to cry just because the sheer panic and fear we felt while trying to race out of those woods. Even though we tried to look around us, we could see nothing, just hear the sounds of the people. We finally made the near 5-hour hike in just under 4. It was an amazing sigh of relief to be able to see the cars. As we ran over to load the gear, I sat in the passenger seat and waited for Danny. None of us have ever returned to that forest. I'm not sure what happened to us over the course of these few summer nights. Some say witchcraft, others say just some woman or kids who were messing with us. Others think it was just our imagination, but we all witnessed the very same thing. I know what I heard that evening, and maybe it doesn't seem that scary to you, but for me it was the most terrifying couple of nights in my life. What a way to start off graduation and my summer vacation.